Hey,
Joining us
Seth.
on 710 KURV, we're talking about a lot of the online reactions to the Israel-Hamas war that's going on right now. Our guest on 710 KURV, who is a social psychologist, and these guys are really unique. So I'm real excited to speak with Dr. Aaron Pomerantz right now. And you have an article at you have an op-ed at Real Clear World titled "Rising Anti-Semitism Highlights the Dangers of Toxic Empathy." Well, first off, what is a social psychologist?
Yes, a social psychologist, rather than dealing with issues of mental health directly, like a counselor or a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, we study human thought, behavior, and emotion in the context of humans as social creatures. So how thoughts, cognition, and emotion are affected by the real and implied presence of others. That's the textbook definition. Basically, how we see ourselves as social creatures, parts of social groups, whether it be families, societies, cultures, you name it, and how that in turn shapes our behavior.
My understanding of what you've so rightly called toxic empathy, it's kind of like, in my opinion, it's like virtue signaling on steroids. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sort of. So I think with virtue or value signaling, what you're seeing is more of a, hey, look at me, I'm important, I belong, please like me. Or, I have value, I am virtuous. With what I'm calling toxic empathy, the outcomes are somewhat similar, but I do think the motivation is different. What you're having here is people online, they're very dedicated to this idea of always identifying with the victim. They are dedicated to the idea of empathy. And I do want to stress, empathy is a good thing. Without it, there's no functional society. But to have real empathy, to the point, this is literally a part of the definition. Real empathy requires the capability to understand others, especially if you want it to have a good result. Well, if you just hear, oh, this person's the victim, I must feel as they feel, I have to try to empathize with them, but you don't know anything about them, you're not actually having a helpful emotional reaction because you're not really responding to a real person, if that makes sense. You're constructing this fictional version of people, of whatever the group is, in your head. So you're going, oh, they're the victims, they're the good guys, they must be like me, I must empathize with them. And then when we do that, we think of ourselves as the victims too, because they're like me, we're all together. And when you think of yourself as a victim, that leads to all sorts of negative outcomes. So what you're kind of seeing here with the Israeli-Palestine situation is people just assume, oh, the Palestinians are victims. Hamas must be the good guys then after October 7th because, they're the victims. If you look at the Hamas charter, it uses terms like colonialism and stuff like that that really appeals to this sort of toxic empathy tendency. And then people assume that they know how Palestinians must think and feel and that they are they're all together. There's all this language of solidarity. You hear things like, freeing Palestine, quote unquote, is everything from an LGBT cause to a reproductive rights cause to you name the cause, they're co-opting it. Because ultimately, when they're feeling this empathy for "quote unquote" Palestinians, they're feeling it for this imagined version of themselves that they're projecting into the conflict, and that's why they just engage in these really, at best, useless and at worst, really, really harmful behaviors, both online and in the real world.
One of the things that's very interesting to me is how selective it can be. Because, for example, when Putin invaded Ukraine and back in the day in Crimea, nobody was saying, "Oh, it's just Putin trying to take the land back," and these are the same people. You know what I mean? It's very, very selective.
It's very, very selective, and it's very, very manipulatable, and that makes it very, very dangerous because, even with the Israeli-Palestine situation, a few months ago, everyone was absolutely on Ukraine's side and Putin was evil. And that's pretty obvious and pretty apparent, I think, from any real analysis of Putin's foreign policy. But the fact that Putin is siding with Hamas, that he and Iran and all these terrible governments are behind Hamas, that just seems to be totally missing from a lot of the mental calculus behind the support for Hamas, or at the very least the downplaying of Hamas, or in reality the opposition to Israel by any means necessary. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels. You rightly point out, Putin's kind of making the same claim for invading Ukraine as Hamas is for the Simchat Torah massacre, and yet no one is siding with Putin.
Joining us on 710 KURV, Dr. Aaron Pomerantz is a social psychologist and researcher. He joins us on your 956 drive home. Davis Rankin, your question.
It's a bifurcated or bifold question. Is it possible, really, to have empathy for someone or a people or a group outside of our experience? In other words, can we imagine something that we've never seen before? Number one, and I forgot what the other part was. So go for it.
All right. Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. I do think we can feel empathy for people we don't know, and for experiences and situations beyond our own personal experience, but it is going to be limited. And it's going to involve some degree of imagination, and that can sort of impact our ability to feel empathy fully unless we start plugging in the gaps with our imagination. And that's dangerous, because it arguably, once you cross a certain threshold of how much that you're plugging in those gaps, you're not really feeling empathy for a real person anymore. I mean, that can be true even in our everyday lives, right? Like you might have, how many times, even with people we know really well, do we think we understand how they're feeling, or do we try to predict their behavior?
Yeah. And
it turns out that it's totally not, that we had totally no idea what they were thinking or feeling or how they were going to react, right? Even in little things, like, I mean, who among us has not bought a birthday present for a loved one that we thought they were going to love and they did not?
That's very true.
Now do it for, yeah, right? Now try to do that sort of mental math for somebody from a very different cultural background, a very different religious background, in a situation that dates back literally thousands of years, and that we in the West, or at least those of us in the West not of Jewish or Arab descent, can't really fathom. And you can see why that would be a recipe for disaster.
You know what gets lost too, like a baby in the bathwater? Our guest is Dr. Aaron Pomerantz, a social psychologist. He's got an article, op-ed in Real Clear World called "Rising Anti-Semitism: Highlighting the Danger of Toxic Empathy." He joins us now. One thing that we're kind of getting I think the internet kind of loses the baby in the bathwater when they discuss any type of social issue, especially world events like this, where they'll think that everybody is on the same page. Like, for example, like everybody, they think that everybody agrees with Hamas, or everybody in Israel agrees with what's going on, or everybody that's Free Palestine has the same motives and intentions and things like that. And a lot of this nuance and variance tends to get lost as the discussion goes on, because everything gets condensed to 140 characters on Twitter.
Yeah. There's actually a name for that. It's called the false consensus effect, where we assume that everyone agrees with us even when they might not. And I think you're absolutely right. It becomes worse on the internet because we can shape our internet experience. These things run on algorithms. Your Twitter, your Instagram, your TikTok, like, these are things shaped to you. So you can't, I mean, this effect works even in everyday life. Before the internet, this was observed. You assume everyone thinks like you think and everyone agrees like you, with what you believe. But now you add an algorithm into that, and it's just like all that effect gets blown up, and all nuance just absolutely goes out the window.
So what would you say a solution is, Dr. Pomerantz? What would you say if we're online and arguing with people on the internet, not the best for the mental health? So what do we do? Is there a solution?
I think there is, but I don't think there's necessarily one solution. I don't think there's an easy one. I think when it comes to this specific issue, there's a couple of things. First of all, being willing to step back and say, I do not have an obligation to have a take. Like, why, you know, if there's this idea that everyone has to have an opinion about everything. You know, I was having this discussion the other day with somebody, and they're like, you know, oh, I can't believe this stuff. I'm talking about Israel-Palestine. And they came out with about, in the span of 30 seconds, 5 just blatant untruths. Like, oh, Jews are all European. And I'm like, no, we're not. Oh, well, you know, Jews are, you know, military occupation of Gaza hasn't been true since 2005. And after this conversation, it's like, I'm like, why do you feel the need to have this? Well, everyone's like kind of pressuring me into it. And I'm like, well, okay, but just saying, hey, I don't know enough, that's a really good first step. And then if you want to educate yourself, like there's a literacy issue here. And we see, you know, because we live in an era where a lot of us have moved on beyond falling for, you know, I am a Nigerian prince and I have $20 million to send you types of scams, we think we know how to navigate the internet. But the fact is we don't, especially for this issue where there's a lot of intentional misinformation out there. I mean, Al Jazeera is basically just Qatar, not basically, it's literally just Qatari propaganda. It's blasting stuff out there. Even the New York Times and the BBC are constantly having to retract and apologize for articles. So if you feel that you need to have a take on Israel-Palestine, do some research. And, you know, I hate that phrase, do research, because these days it tends to mean I Googled something and clicked the first link I found. Well, no, that's not what I mean by do your research. Do some actual hard reading. Be willing to have discussions with people who disagree with you. And above all, like, get your emotions out of it. You know, you want to have empathy for these people. You want to have empathy for victims of injustice. That's great. That's a noble and important motivation to have. But make sure you're dealing with real people and that you have enough knowledge to be dealing with real people. And that it's not just ultimately you creating this fictional thing that you can be angry about and make yourself feel righteous, which is what I think an overwhelming amount of people in the current discourse, certainly those justifying Hamas, I think that's what they're doing.
I have to tell you, Dr. Pomerantz, I loved this discussion. I hope to have a similar one very, very soon. Thanks a lot for spending some time with us here today.
You.
That is social psychologist Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. You can check out his op-ed at Real Clear World. Rising Anti-Semitism highlights the danger of toxic empathy. You're listening to News Talk 710 KURV.